everyone. Welcome to the Best Practices for Internal Investigations webinar from Wolters Kluwer. I'm Beth Kolodny, National Sales Manager from Wolters Kluwer. Also with me is Lynn Reinheimer, Senior Manager of ComplyTrack Editors and Sales Engineers. Before we begin today's webinar and introduce our featured speakers, I just want to cover a few quick housekeeping items. To submit questions, please use the question and answer menu bar located in the right hand of your screen, as all lines have been placed on mute. To download a copy of today's presentation and special free policy that was developed just for this webinar, you'll need to go to the URL that was sent out in the reminder email this morning, or use the link posted in the GoToWebinar Handouts tab. That's right on the right side. CEUs, today's webinar has been approved for CEUs from the HCCA, and an email with the survey and download instructions will be sent within 24 hours of the webinar. Now, to introduce today's special speakers, both from Strategic Management Services. Richard Cusero served for 11 years as the Inspector General for HHS, where he was responsible for all investigations performed by and on behalf of the Department's 180 programs, most notably Medicare and Medicaid. Prior to that, he had a career in the FBI as a special executive. He established strategic management in 1992 and has provided a broad range of advisory services. He has assisted organizations by providing interim and designated compliance officer services and has provided specialized expertise on fraud and abuse, sanctions, exclusion, and debarment processes. Our other speakers, Kash Chopra, she is JD MBA and a CHC professional, focusing her practice in the development, implementation, and evaluation of compliance programs across the healthcare industry. Kash has served as an interim and outsourced compliance officer and routinely advises advisory services to clients related to a number of compliance, regulatory, and legal issues. Additionally, she is an experienced professional in conducting compliance investigations, providing education and training on conducting effective internal investigations. She conducts independent compliance investigations for clients at the request of Board of Directors, Counsel, and Compliance Management. And now I'm going to hand the phone over to Dick. Would you like to take the phone?
Thank you. Well, I want to start off by making a note that Wolters Kluwer hosts a blog that I do on compliance. There's an indication as to how you could register, or if you just send me an email. My email is at the end of the program. I'll take care of the registration for you, and if it works for you, great. If it doesn't, you can unsubscribe at any time. I think that I want to also mention as part of that reminder that one of the premiums that you have for this webinar is that we have a policy template that you're welcome to have free of charge, and really relates to one of the taxing problems that many compliance officers and others that conduct internal investigations have when it comes to when and under what circumstances should legal counsel be involved. So that's a protocol document. If you're interested in it, that you should be sure to get that template and try to adapt it to your own circumstances. Today's objectives are pretty limited. We certainly want to talk about what it takes and elements and means and how to execute, but basically this is a familiarization to internal investigations. It's not meant to turn somebody into a professional investigator. If you were to look at what it takes to train an FBI agent at the National Academy, it's many months. The same thing is true at the National Law Enforcement Training Center in Glencoe, Georgia, for many other law enforcement agencies. So it's not to turn anybody into a professional investigator, but what it really is we're trying to do here is to accept the fact that for most people that are participating today, it is a situation where you can go many months without ever having a need for an investigation, then suddenly having something spring up that requires you to conduct an investigation. And what we now want to do is provide you some tips and suggestions and kind of give you and alert you to the right practices that you should follow so that you could avoid making some glaring and costly errors. We oftentimes are called in to assist after I won't say an investigation has been botched, but where an investigation has gone off track and is much more difficult to put it back on track than it would have been if it had been done correctly in the beginning. So hopefully we will be able to give you today some of these tips and suggestions and ideas and warning signals as to how to go about doing a good internal investigation. Now, added to the fact that compliance officers are oftentimes called on to do internal investigations, we also remember that probably more investigations are conducted by HRM than even compliance, and sometimes you have safety and security as doing investigations, internal audit, legal counsel, so there's a wide variety of people that might do internal investigations, but in any case, these principles that we're going to be discussing today would apply to any of those cast of characters that might get involved in it. One of the things that we need to look at is that, quite frankly, what is an internal investigation? And it is a very broad definition. It's an objective inquiry. You want to ascertain what the true facts of a situation are. It is a part of the internal control system. If there's a breakdown in internal controls and something is happening, an investigation might be called upon to determine what went wrong, and if there's somebody responsible for the wrongdoing, how do you go about addressing the remediation of that problem? So an investigation is very generalized. It can cover a wide variety of things, but basically it's a fact-gathering process that's objective in nature. There are many purposes for an investigation. You certainly want to be sure that everyone is complying with applicable laws, regulations, rules, code of conduct, policies and procedures, and so forth. And then also is that it can be very valuable for management to really understand some of the issues that are swirling around the organization that may be troubling to the workforce, or quite frankly troubling for the organization in terms of complying with requirements of payers. The fact is that as a result of investigations, you'll oftentimes see that there is a need to have a change in the policy procedures, that something went wrong because there was a lack of understanding on the part of the workforce as to what was expected of them or how they were supposed to carry out a policy. And one of the big difficulties that we have in many of our clients is they have these wonderful policy documents but don't have procedures. And the procedures are really to help people understand how they carry out what the policy calls for. So this is a good information gathering exercise when you find something went wrong as to why it went wrong. Oftentimes it's a misunderstanding of policy procedures. Also is that it allows taking corrective action when problems are identified, and that's really important. Many times it's also responding to regulatory enforcement actions by outside parties. This could be a government agency, or it could be as a result of litigation of some sort that's been initiated by an employee with an attorney. It could be any number of things that needs a response from the organization. What is the true facts of what we're dealing with here, so we can be able to meet the challenge with knowledge rather than just guessing as to what it is to be done. So in this case, you can perform a lot of services on behalf of the organization if it's done correctly. This means really it is important. Certainly, one of the things that has come through in this last year has been redefining how very strict rules on how soon you have to disclose to the government if in fact you have a violation of law or regulation. And the clock starts ticking pretty fast. It starts ticking the first time you have that phone call to the hotline or somebody reports something to the compliance officer, and therefore you have to move with a great deal of celerity to be able to make a decision as to whether something is in fact a potential violation that must be reported, or on the other side, if it's an emerging problem that that is going to get worse over time, that you address before that it grows into something that is much more serious. It also is that in defending against situations where some other parties are aware of something similar that's being reported internally, it allows you to move quickly to correct the problem before it goes too far outside, or you're ready to respond to anybody when they do come in because you've already done your work. It also, from a government standpoint, it allows you to have answers to questions. What went wrong? What did you do about it? Did you hold people accountable for wrongdoing? Was there wrongdoing? Those kinds of questions you already have the answers for. Overall, what it does is that it reassures everybody. When I say that, it means it's not only reassuring management that they have an active force that's out there looking for the causes of problems and to address them before they grow into something that may lead to liabilities, but also reassures the workforce that when they do have concerns, that management's concerned about it, management will take action, and that they will not have the need to go externally. Because one thing that's very clear is that all the evidence has shown that in these qui-tam cases is that there's been a disproportionate number of people who are qui-tam relievers that feel the need to say, I didn't bring this with the idea of making money. I did it because there was not an internal means by which I could have this problem resolved properly, and the only avenue I had was to go externally. It's said so often that you have to give some credence that this, in fact, is a factor to be concerned about. If you don't move quickly on an issue or you don't move properly on an issue, it may, in fact, turn into something that goes externally. And that external thing could be a qui-tam action filed with the Department of Justice. It could be a hotline call to the OIG. It could be something leaked to the local press, or it could be somebody going to an attorney to initiate a tort action of some sort. Also, quite frankly, investigations is a critical element of any compliance program that wants to be perceived as being effective. If you do not have a good compliance capability and you do not act upon information that's brought to your attention, it is the view of the government you do not have an effective program.
You mentioned something really interesting. You said quick and effective when it comes to responding to potential problems. Before you can even act quick and efficient towards a possible problem, you have to ask the question, who's responsible in the first place? Organizations are like ecosystems, and there are many different bodies and people inside that ecosystem that make it work. Particularly in the case of an investigation, you have legal, compliance, and of course HR. I once worked for a boss, a general counsel, who pulled me into his office early in my career and told me, Kosh, legal are the people that are going to keep you, or are going to bail you out of trouble. Compliance are the people that will keep you out of trouble with their rules and policies. And HR, well, they're the people who are going to keep you sane along the way. At the end of the day, it comes down to three critical factors: collaboration, communication, and coordination. As we're trying to get to with the policy, the free policy that's in your presentation handouts today, it's important to think about how each of these different roles are going to collaborate and whose responsibility an investigation is really going to be. In this slide, I also mentioned other actors. It may be common for a privacy officer to need to be brought into an investigation as well. There are a lot of other factors that can come into play, but it really is up to a compliance officer, legal counsel, and HR to define their lines and what's going to be under their turf before an investigation even needs to be initiated. So when should legal counsel become involved? There is a great value in looping in legal for a number of different cases. If an issue is highly sensitive in nature, that should be a clear signal that it's important to reach out to legal and make sure that they're involved, even if it is going to be under the compliance radar and under compliance's responsibility to conduct that investigation. Another reason that legal might need to be looped in is you may want to conduct the investigation under privilege. There will be instances where sometimes outside counsel may need to be brought in as well. I can't tell you how many times I've been brought in as a compliance consultant to conduct an outside investigation under privilege for an organization. So ask yourselves two questions. One, what is the level of seriousness for the allegation? And two, what policies, laws, and regulations are really involved? Investigations all come down to building blocks. Every organization, by its key nature, has building blocks. You have your compliance hotline, your reporting protocols, your code of conduct, which should really be like the constitution for your organization. You have policy development, you have protocols with HR and legal, like I just mentioned, and you might have investigator training that you've put different people and departments through. Really, it comes down to understanding what rules, regulations, and laws are applying to your organization, and how you put those building blocks in place so that you know how to address situations when they occur. Investigation programs are really important to put in place before you're in a fire drill. A fire drill is not the time to figure out where your hydrant is. You want to know where it is so you can attack a problem when it comes up without being in a panic mode. And at the end of the day, you also want to understand how to formalize informal processes. Like I've said, we all have pieces to the puzzle here. And there are a lot of processes that our organizations have that may not be down in policies and procedures. These informal processes do matter when it comes to workplace problems that might result in an investigation. They do count in how we might want to address problems and what we're relying on when we write our final report, which we'll talk about a little later on.
For more than 20 years, I've worked with related organizations that provide hotline services. And we currently do that now. We've been keeping track of data for 20 years, and in the course of those 20 years, there's a couple of things that come up, some generalizations about what are the allegations that most likely require something that would qualify as really an internal investigation. And this is a list, and it seems pretty constant. Sometimes the order in which you see them will move around a little bit, but the fact of the matter is that looking at this, you'll see that the vast majority of any allegation or complaint that would come in warranting investigation, a serious investigation, would probably fall into one of these categories. Some of these categories run across, as Kosh was noting, across other actors. Sometimes you'll get an allegation or a complaint that has several allegations in it, and the complaint may have an allegation about unlawful harassment or discrimination, but at the same time may also talk about theft, or may talk about a privacy violation that might involve other people. Oftentimes, when you consider the fact that in a great many cases the motivation of the caller is something that's happening to them that they feel is wrong, and sometimes if it's their boss that they're complaining about, they feel that they need to keep an added book to sort of reinforce that that person is not doing things the way they should be. So it may be that they feel they're being harassed, but at the same time they keep a book on that same person that shows that they're engaged in other wrongful activities. So all of a sudden you may have an investigation that has HR issues. It may have HIPAA issues. It may actually have other issues that really are not really strictly in the bailiwick of the compliance office. Theft of property or is sometimes an issue of that, or a security threat may involve other parties as well. So when Kosh says that trying to get a way to cooperate and to collaborate and to make sure that you work together is very important. And the more you do, we work out those protocols in advance, not just with legal counsel, but the protocols of the other actors that Kosh had mentioned about HR, or maybe the HIPAA Privacy Security Office, or whatever it may be. Before you have an issue, the better off it is. There's nothing worse than to all of a sudden have a turf war emerge as to who's in charge of an investigation because you have not worked out that treaty arrangement in the form of policies and procedures and written guidance. So this really does lead up to the needed policies. You really need a variety of policies to pre-position yourself against the day in which you have a serious investigation. And as to govern not only the hotline operations, but how you go about conducting the investigation, and describe some of the other issues that are associated with investigations, or those things that predicate an investigation. And it takes it all the way down to the investigative records management problem, or when you have to disclose it to outside authorities. But there are a lot of issues that are really critical to this program. The OIG has made a point to really specify in their compliance guidance that you should have separate policies that ensure the fact that somebody can report things in confidentially. It also separately says if they could report anonymously. The Department of Justice has said the same thing. The United States Sentencing Commission, all of them say that anonymity should be offered as well as confidentiality, because many people feel reluctant to report for fear of retribution and retaliation if in fact they are identified, which means that the other policy that is always highlighted in all the compliance documents is non-retaliation. So you should be getting these policies in place before you start getting involved in a real investigation. And now this slide basically is taking the fact as what are you doing in an investigation? There's no more than what a reporter does. These are the common reporter questions: who, what, where, when, why, and how. And that's what you really are going to want to find out when you identify the scope of the investigation, what you're trying to achieve from that investigation. You're really going to have to be focusing on answering these kinds of questions, and therefore you really should do your homework as to what it takes to resolve an issue. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what you should do by way of homework to prepare yourself by knowing what you know versus knowing what you don't know. But this is very important to know. This is no different than a reporter, no different than anybody else. When you are doing an investigation, you want to have these questions answered.
I'm going to sound like a bit of a broken record throughout this webinar, but might as well hammer it in while you have me. It's very important to define the roles of everyone who's going to be responsible for an investigation. Legal, compliance, HR, as we mentioned, privacy as well. We all drive and operate in our own lanes for the most part, but it is important to understand how to work together and how to drive in one another's lanes at times. We do collaborate. But by working things out before you're in the heat of things for an investigation, by defining things through protocols, who will take care of what circumstance and situation, it prevents us from crashing into one another while we're driving on the same roads with one another. It really comes down to coordinating transparency and making sure that you can formalize this through policies and protocols. Make sure that if you're going to lay out whose responsibility is what in a protocol document, that these are rules that you can live with. You don't want to make a policy or protocol defining, I'll just say the word TERFs that was mentioned earlier, if you can't live with that result that's down on a piece of paper. It's only going to make things worse. And that's also a great time to remind you of the free policy we have in your presentation handouts today. So common complaint sources. At the end of the day, you have different ways that complaints can come in. You have what I call open doors, but you also have hotline intake. Most organizations, as a best practice, should have an anonymous hotline where employees or vendors can call in and report possible allegations. But we have many open door policies as well, where someone will come in and just strike up conversation, which may lead to the need for an inquiry or investigation. You're going to hear me talk about a concept about documentation quite a bit over the course of this webinar, and I'm going to hammer it in pretty well because it's important that no matter what complaint source starts an inquiry or investigation, you want to make sure that you take it down into a log, which we'll get into a little bit later. Some organizations also keep anonymous tips through mailboxes or suggestion boxes, which is another idea if you feel like you need one on the side of your property. I will say that as a part of best practice, it is incredibly common for complaints and allegations to be very HR.
Kosh?
I think we're having a technical issue. Dick?
It seems like we lost audio. Kosh, can you hear us?
I can.
Oh, okay, you're back. There we go. You were out. You blipped out for a minute.
Well, I'll just pick up where I left off, that it is very common to get a lot of HR complaints and inquiries, whether it be through open doors or through your anonymous hotline. So don't be concerned if that's the case. And just remind yourself, it's okay to collaborate with HR and make sure you have control over who's going to be controlling your HR complaints and whether you're going to be involved in those investigations or not. So when it comes to investigation logs, as I just mentioned, it's incredibly important to track. So you must be asking yourself, why do I need to track every single complaint or allegation that comes in? It sounds incredibly tedious, but I will tell you from experience that situations do occur where that log is going to come into question and you're going to need to refer back to it. I've been in a number of situations over the course of my legal and compliance career where a disgruntled employee might say, well, I raised this concern to HR and legal many times, but no one paid attention to it. Sometimes it's important to make sure that in those cases, you can go back and flat out say with facts that you did look into every allegation that came to you. It's really all about consistency and reliability. The consistency and reliability that all allegations and complaints will be evaluated in a systemic way and all with the same equal understanding. Not all complaints are going to turn into a full-fledged investigation or inquiry. Some may be unfounded. However, it is very important to make sure that you've documented, one, that it came into you, two, who is assigned responsibility. Is that HR? Is that legal? or is that compliance, or maybe outsourced? And what did you do to follow up? When your investigation or inquiry or complaint is resolved, you want to make sure that that is taken down as well. Oftentimes, boards of directors will ask for quarterly reports asking how many open cases are going on in your department, both legal, HR, and compliance. You don't want to have a report showing that you've had an open case for over 90 days that you just haven't paid attention to.
Let me just add, if I could, on this, that the documentation is really critical, because many times a case may be viewed by an outside party. And for example, if you have an unlawful harassment investigation, if you read the case law, you'll see that a very important part of liability that may be attributable to the organization, it will depend upon how aggressive they were in addressing the original complaint and investigated. If they don't have a good documentary trail to show they did that, they could have a problem. The same thing is true with the Department of Justice and the OIG. They're going to look to see whether you did your job the right way and had an effective compliance program, and if you can show that, then maybe the individual may be viewed as a rogue. If in fact you don't show that you were very aggressive in what you were doing to address this warning, then of course they would view that the liability for the organization is going to be greater.
Now, you've heard me use two different terms over the course of this webinar thus far. I've used the term inquiry, and I've also used the term investigation. For practical reasons, the difference between an internal inquiry and investigation is largely a matter of semantics. Investigation as a term is a very charged term that can elevate a matter higher than is necessary sometimes. It also can make people very nervous if they're part of that investigation. Sometimes that can lead to unintended results. Further, it may raise general employee or union concerns, draw media attention, or legislative action. As such, internal inquiry should be used over an investigation where possible. Inquiries are typically less formal, and investigations are typically far more formal and may require more documentation in ways of a formal report. This slide really breaks down what I like to call the anatomy of an internal investigation, which here at SMS we like to break down into 7 different steps, the 7 investigative steps. We do have a lot to cover over the course of this webinar, so we're going to jump right in to step 1, which is gathering background and triage.
With regard to establishing background, this is almost a context setting kind of a slide here, and that is you really should have within the organization some sort of a duty to report on the part of employees. But if you give them a duty to report, then they need to know that somebody's going to be listening to what it is that they report. And you're going to have to gain the confidence of the workforce that you will be able to handle things professionally, and that by them stepping forward to either report a problem or to participate in an investigation as a witness, that in fact they're not going to get themselves into a lot of personal problems. This is why that we talk about anonymity and confidentiality when you're talking generally to people in compliance education and training programs. You want to talk about that. And when you're talking about somebody who is reporting a problem, you want to talk to them about it. When you're talking to witnesses, you want to be sure that they understand that the interview is confidential and will be on a need-to-know basis for anybody else, and your name will not be quoted in other interviews and things of that sort. So you really need to build trust in the whole process. If you don't have this general trust built up, then it's going to be very, very difficult to overcome that as a barrier and gain confidence of people to be able to have them cooperate and to have them help you solve a problem. And if you just think about it a little bit, if you were in their shoes and something were to come up and they were to be drawn in, how would you feel? You'd probably be a little defensive, you'd be a little bit nervous. And so the more you can do in advance to sort of pre-sell the marketplace that reporting is what you have to do, but in doing so, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to set up a hornet's nest for yourself. It's really important part of setting the stage. When it comes down to receiving a complaint, it's easier in a medical environment. Certainly in a hospital, everybody knows what triaging is. Patients coming in and they've got multiple wounds, and right off the bat, they're trying to establish what needs to be treated first and how to go about doing it. In investigations, it's the same thing. It's a process by which you're going to rank the issues. Now, as I mentioned earlier, that you can have a complaint with several different allegations to it. So in the triaging, you're going to be looking at if there are multiple allegations, which ones need to be taken in what order, who's going to be doing the work, and you're going to have to do a quick assessment as to what needs to be done by whom and over what time frame. And if you don't do that at the outset, you're going to find that you may have lost control of the investigation. So it may be that all you're going to have to do is focus on one issue that's straightforward, but on the other hand, you may have a bunch of different issues that will cut across a lot of different territory, and that needs to be sorted out as to how you're going to deal with those issues. And then the triaging really, who's going to do it really depends upon who's got the ticket on the thing. As Scott pointed out, if an issue comes into as HR, with most complaints really are HR based, if they're leading it, well then they will be the ones that might be triaging it and trying to decide what needs to be done. If it's something that comes from security or from legal, or they would be having that role to play, or in the case of compliance officer, which really is going to be receiving a lot of information through the hotline. When they receive the information through the hotline, one of the first steps they're going to have to do is in the triaging is to say who is going to pick up on this. Who's the one that's going to be doing it? Is this a compliance office issue, or is it an HR issue, or maybe it's a legal counsel issue, or maybe it's a privacy officer situation, or maybe it's internal audit. So those decisions need to be made very quickly up front, and haven't sit around trying to decide who's going to do what is going to be bad, which goes back as another refrain to what has been previously underscored a couple times, and that is have your protocol document worked out in advance as to how you work with people in various arenas that may be involved in investigation. How does compliance work with HR? How do they work with legal? How do they work with internal audit? How do they work with these other functions that may get involved in a complaint or an allegation?
This is where I'd like you to get a little bit closer to your Polycom, because I'm going to say something that I hope is etched in your brain forever. Investigations are not like wine. They do not get better with age. It is incredibly important to think about timeliness when you're conducting an investigation. As I mentioned, you don't want to have an open case for over 90 days that may be increasing your risk profile to your board, to the feds, whoever it might be. A proper investigation program, at the end of the day, is really about mitigating risk and making sure that you're identifying risk that might come up through these investigations. It is very rare that an investigation will be initiated that needs to be both completed, initiated, and documented within a 24-hour or 3 business day period. It is not a sprint. However, timeliness does matter. This is where the triaging gets really important. You want to make sure that you're flagging complaints and addressing them to the degree appropriate. And as I mentioned earlier, you want to make sure you're following up and that any status of a complaint is being properly documented.
This slide looks pretty straightforward. Confidentiality versus anonymity. It looks pretty pedestrian. It is not. It's surprising how often that this becomes an issue of major contention within organizations. There are many attorneys, for example, that says, well, I don't want to give credibility to any evidence that comes from an anonymous source. I want to know who is providing the information so I can assess its reliability. So what I'm going to say in the face of that is this. You should encourage anonymity, not confidentiality. Wherever possible, try to maintain anonymity in the caller and negotiate their identity only when it's in the interest of the organization. Now here's the reason why. If you don't know who it is, you don't have to protect them. If you know who the person is that's reporting it, then you bear the burden of maintaining protection against any retaliation, reprisals that may occur. And many times what you will have is that you will have people that want to be on record as a whistleblower because of the fact that they feel that that is a way in which they can protect themselves from already movement in their direction towards some sort of adverse action. So a lot of times when people realize management is moving to take action against them, suddenly decide that they want to be a whistleblower, and then they say, well, your reason you're taking action against me is reprisal. So basically, guard against that by encouraging anonymity, but at the same time, if there is information that really necessitates knowing the authorship of that information so you could act on it more appropriately. Then you make the decision and negotiate the confidentiality by saying you'll protect them to the limit of the law if they will identify themselves. We really need to have that information because without knowing who you are, we aren't be able to do this, that, or something else. The other thing about confidentiality is that it stretches through the entire investigation. And what that means is that when you're talking to people, you're also going to remind them that the information that they're providing is confidential on a need-to-know basis, that will not be shared willy-nilly, and what they tell you as a witness will not be quoted to somebody else. You need to have that in order to relieve the tension of somebody wanting to volunteer information for fear that they will have an adverse effect on their relationship with somebody or their own personal standing in the organization. Now we're going to move to step 2 in terms of plan the investigation. So let's move on to that right away and let's take a look at that. This is a pretty straightforward chart that talks about really at the outset really kind of defining the scope of the investigation, which really means what needs to be done, how soon, and by whom. Now, by whom is important because we don't have that listed exactly right there. But when in the beginning you're going to have to decide who has the lead on this investigation, who's qualified to do the work. Will it be a team? Will it involve maybe somebody from HR with compliance, or will it be somebody alone in compliance, or will it be who will do the work? And is that person qualified? So really, that whole thing comes in the front end of the project. Then, when you have to decide, also you have to determine who is the deciding authority. In other words, you're going to conduct an investigation. Who's going to be the recipient of the information that you provide? That's really important because you need to have conversations with that party as to what they need in order to make a decision. And without having that deciding authority clearly in mind, you can move this investigation in the wrong direction. At the end, somebody saying, well, what I really needed was this, that, or something else, and you did not include it. So knowing who that deciding official is going to be is very, very important. You also want to create an investigative plan. And what that really means is laying out the order in which you're going to do things. The investigation really usually involves 2 major categories of information: documentary evidence and then also witness interviews. And you want to gather on the front end what information that documentary-wise that you can have that can assist you in the investigation. You do that first. Then you want to decide what other information do you need, and you gather that as you go along. But then you need to know the order in which you want to interview people. That's logical. What you don't want to do is keep going back to the same person. You talk to one person, and when you talk to a second person, you realize you didn't ask enough questions for the first person, and all of a sudden you begin to have the investigation get protracted. And as Kosh says, that this is not like wine. It doesn't get better with age. In fact, we can sour pretty quickly because what happens is when investigation gets started, oftentimes that rumor mill starts going to work. And the longer you are conducting the investigation, or more that you're moving back and forth with different people, the more the information is leaking out in one form or another that may be dangerous and unuseful for the organization. And then you have to have somewhere along the line, you have a briefing session. And what you want to know is, what do we have now? Are we on the right track? Do we have enough? What's missing? What further steps might be necessary? So what you're really doing is you really want to determine what is known, and then by the implication, what still remains unknown to move it off square one.
You know, Dick just mentioned an interesting concept about the rumor mill. It's incredibly important to start gathering your evidence, interviewing individuals, and figuring out what you know and what you don't know before that rumor mill can start tainting possible interviews, evidence, and anything you might need to gather over the course of an investigation. You might be able to tell by now I'm a woman of analogies. Investigations, I think, are like bird cages. If you have a bird cage and you have a dish of water and a dish of feed, you're going to think you're going to find a bird in that cage, not a dog. It's incredibly important to know what you know, but know what you don't know. This step in slide is all about mapping out what you're going to need to get from your interviews and along the course of your investigation. Make sure that you understand all the factual evidence surrounding allegations. Understand if there are contracts involved. Are there limitations or clauses that you need to refer to in investigation interviews, or perhaps refer to in your final investigative report. Understand what is implicated. Look at your code of conduct, or as I like to call it, the constitution of your organization. Policies, rules, regulation, and one of my favorites, the law. And make sure that you can identify anyone who might have relevant evidence. And now we move into finally starting the investigation file. The investigation file itself, as you can tell, I love documentation, is going to include a few different things. You're going to have your interview reports, statements, your final investigative report, perhaps your interview log, and legal memoranda. I've always been a big fan of legal memoranda, especially since I used to be in legal departments myself. At times, the legal department may want to keep legal memos on file so that future instances that pull off regulatory question marks or how something should be applied inside your organization, they may want to keep that on file. These are sometimes great appendices to have in your investigative file. When it comes to document control, it's incredibly important to keep everything together and to have great document management. Really, it's all about document control and restricted access. For example, if you have a file share folder on your network drive at the office, you want to make sure that all your investigation reports are held in a place where half the company doesn't have access to it. Make sure that you have restricted access to any of your investigative reports, and any physical evidence is kept under lock and key, either in the compliance department, HR, or perhaps legal, depending on who's in control of the investigation.
In that connection, it should be noted that one of the mistakes that's oftentimes made by people conducting investigations when they're working with documents, they work with original documents. The original documents really should be locked up, and you should be working with copies. It's a huge mistake to work with original, and you have something like that go astray. Work with copies and not the original. Now we're up to step 4, which is execute interim actions. And I want to talk a little bit about interim reports. Oftentimes, if it's a high-profile investigation and management is alerted to it, maybe even the board, they all want to have what are the preliminary results? The one thing you must avoid at all costs is putting in writing interim reports, because what happens then is it's not complete and new information comes in, the report changes, and you have to assume that at some point it's possible that this may be involved where outside parties will have access to it, attorneys or government agencies and so on. If it looks like that you're giving an interim report to management, then all of a sudden the report changes. The implication may be you changed the report based because it was under the influence of management trying to get you to do something different or whatever. But just unless it's absolutely necessary, do not prepare an interim report in writing. If you have to give an interim report, it's better to do it verbally, because expect that it will continue to change and evolve. Somebody will come forward with some new information and change the direction of the investigation, or some new document may come to light, and therefore you could have an entirely different picture after you have given your interim briefing or report. However, you may need to do that, because it may be that you talk to the deciding official and you say, look, the investigation is going down this track. Actually, but what we have found is something entirely different, more significant, that's moving us in a different direction, and so you're going to let that party know that's moving in a different direction and how they feel about it, because they're going to be the one that's going to have to resolve whatever issues you raise from that. Also, you may have to brief people while the investigation is going on, because there may be some action that has been triggered that needs to be handled. It cannot languish. It needs to be handled even before the investigation is complete. So anyway, keep in mind, interim reporting is important, but do so very, very carefully. There are other types of interim actions. You know, there's a lot of different actors that you have here. You started off with a person that maybe predicated the investigation with a complaint. You may have witnesses you've talked to. You've got the deciding officials. You've got other people that you may be working with in legal counsel or HR. So there may be communications that are taking place. However, the one thing you must really at the same time always remember is the issue of confidentiality, making sure that inappropriate information is not being spread. Certainly, individual comments by witnesses should not be identified as such. Care has to be taken so that you do not add to the rumor mill. That basically, when you start talking to anybody, anything, they may in turn talk to somebody else. All hell could break loose if you're not careful. Also is that in any investigation, and we're putting it here, but it can be at any point, it should be made very, very clear that once an investigation starts, there is nothing, no document or no information can be destroyed or altered until the conclusion of the investigation.
And just to add on to what Dick just said, when it comes to preserving documents and making sure no one destroys something that's pertinent towards the investigation, in these communications that you send out, one, it's definitely an email that you do not want to send off your phone saying in the heat of the moment, everyone stop, hold, please don't do anything, don't speak to anyone. It's an email and communication that you want to think about and draft properly, because you don't want to strike terror in anyone that you're sending these communications out to. And two, when it comes to emails, it's worth sometimes calling out in these emails that you want to send out that people should not hit the delete button in their Outlook. Emails can be very pertinent to investigations and can become part of evidence and need to be referred to in the final report as well. Which brings me into step 5, which is gathering documentary evidence and conducting the interviews. When it comes to gathering and managing evidence, as I said before, it's very important to keep control and to have restricted access on anything you gather during the course of an investigation. Whether it be photocopies or scans, you want to make sure that everything is locked away or in a very restricted area of your computer or file share. I mentioned earlier that investigations are like pieces of a puzzle. You have to put them all together. And you want to treat all of these pieces as sensitive and important information. And remember to keep treating them all with the same level of confidentiality. As an attorney, I like to work off tangible facts, documents, data, and other evidence. At the end of the day, they're all part of the fact pattern that you're gathering in the course of your investigation. They're pieces of the puzzle. This can be electronic emails, pictures, recordings, security logs. They're all important to gather and make sure that you keep in that restricted access areas. Interviews and statements are commonly going to be the core of your investigation.
When you get started in an interview process, you'll be talking to people. The very fact that you're talking to them sometimes kind of strikes, I could probably even say, fear into them, certainly concern. They are afraid that the interview and what they say might affect their relationship with their peers. It might reflect adversely on them from management. They don't know why they're being interviewed, whether that they are in trouble or could get in trouble. So it's really important that you be prepared to answer some of these questions up front. This all comes under what we'll be talking about, and that is establishing rapport at the outset of any interview. The outset, what it is that when you establish rapport, which really should take 5 or 6 minutes at any interview, you should start off getting people to relax a little bit, talk about anything, talk about the weather if you want to, but talk about how long they've been with the organization and you know, where they're working, anything they can that will relax them a little bit, easy questions, so that you can now observe their behavior when it's in a non-threatening mode or where you're really not being substantive to the investigation, because later on you can compare their behavior when you start asking more difficult questions. But start off with easy questions. Start off with trying to let them know that why they're being interviewed and that they're not going to be in trouble, and that and again, going back to confidentiality, that what they say is not going to be communicated to anybody that doesn't have a need to know. This brings us to, and when we have larger training sessions that are a day or 2 days long that really focus on this slide an awful lot, and that is the difference between an interview and interrogation. Interview usually is with a witness that's neutral, and interrogation is with somebody who's hostile or tend to be hostile or might be the subject of the investigation. And you can see there's a real big difference, and that is really when you're doing an interview, it's really a conversation with a purpose. It's used to obtain leads, develop information, establish evidence, and so forth. Again, what you really want to do is you want to establish rapport with somebody and make it sort of on a conversational level. You want to use open-ended questions. You want to let them tell a story in their own way. You want to have as much as possible be a dialogue. And then at the same time, what you really want to do is you want to watch their behavior as different questions being asked. Interrogation, on the other hand, is different. You still want to start off with the same thing, establishing a rapport. You don't want to be hostile to them, but it tends to be more confrontational than it is conversational. You're going to use closed-ended questions rather than having an open-ended question where you say, "Tell me in your own words what happened." You may be asking questions where you want them to answer yes or no, closed-ended questions, so they don't wander off. Because normally, if you have somebody who feels threatened because they may be the subject of the investigation or for other reasons, they'll have a tendency to want to have the conversation drift off in a different direction, and you can lose control right away. So keep it closed-ended questions, and you may have to find that you're coaxing them to provide answers, and you may have to, in interrogation, help break them down by challenging their answers and the inconsistencies that you have in their answers, and so on. Again, as with interviews, for different reasons that you want to read behavior to help judge as to what kind of information you're getting from that party. There are a number of investigative standards that need to be followed if you want to do this correctly. You know, you've got to be thorough in what you do, which means that you really have to follow very carefully the rules and the regulations that you have established for your compliance investigations. You must always show respect for the rights and privacy of all those involved, including as subject of an investigation. You should be very, very respectful to them. You should not talk down to them at all. You immediately will alienate anybody you do that to. Impartial. The focus is you are not there to be a judge and jury. You're there to only gather facts to another party, a third party, to be able to act upon those facts to make a decision. So you really want to remain very, very impartial, neutral, and you want to act that way. And that means that you want to be objective. You want to be able to pull the evidence together without bias. You don't want to search for proof that somebody did something, because then what you're doing, you're on a hunt to prove somebody wrong rather than gathering objective evidence that will lead to the wrongdoer, if that's the case. And then timeliness is really important. That's the old, that goes back to the wine again. You know, it doesn't get better with age. And I'm telling you, the truth is that in the case of an investigation, there are many times an investigation can really turn sour in a relatively short period of time. So you really need to move very, very quickly to either prove or disprove the issues that are being investigated. The techniques that you employ must always be appropriate to the circumstances, and they must follow clearly established procedures and rules and way you do business. Again, hopefully it's set out in your policies and procedures, but you want to be very careful that you do that. And it must be independent. You can't use anybody that may have known the suspected wrongdoer or was close to other people who are going to be interviewed. Use somebody who's independent so they can be free, not only in fact, but also in appearance from anybody, and looking at it as to whether they are impaired in the way they're going about doing their work. Because anything affecting independence must be reported and resolved to the authorizing authority. And if it comes up to any kind of litigation, if it shows that there was bias because of the fact they were not independent, you could actually have a good investigation suddenly be thrown out.
To all of our listeners right now, I think I know exactly what you're thinking. You're wondering, why are there so many steps to conducting an investigation? Honestly, over the last years of my career, I've lost track of how many investigations and interviews I've conducted. But I can say that I make sure to take time to prepare and execute every interview with all of these steps. It's honestly become second nature. At the end of the day, preparation is key. And you want to think before you act, but you want to act with purpose. So before you conduct the interview itself, you should follow some of the steps that are on this slide. One, as we said, you want to identify your purpose and set the goals for each interview. Think about what you know and what you don't know. What are you trying to accomplish with these interviews? Then you want to review the available information, and of course remember employee rights. Are you interviewing someone who's part of a union? Do they need to have a union rep present? These are all considerations. As Dick mentioned, you also want to make sure you can protect confidentiality. And then of course, outline your interview questions, if you have forms or if you have a waiver for them to sign. When it comes to outlining your interview questions, I think that writing out your questions is a good idea as a loose structure to go off of, but don't become overly reliant on writing out a script. It starts to feel very clinical. You do want to have, as Dick said, a conversation with a purpose. But it is a great idea to outline what you're trying to accomplish and the questions you want to make sure that you get in. Then, of course, you want to schedule the interview. So as I mentioned, I'm not going to linger on this slide for too long. You want to make sure that you're reviewing certain things before your interview. As I mentioned, employee rights and what available information you have. On this slide, I do want to point out one thing, insubordination. It's very important to check with HR. In the event that an employee declines to cooperate and doesn't want to have a meeting with you or be part of your investigation, sit for an interview, you want to make sure with HR whether that's going to be considered as insubordination on their record. Remember, after all, that being part of an interview is voluntary. And as Dick mentioned, you always want to remember anonymity and confidentiality. I can't tell you, there have been a few times where I've been part of investigations, and the person that was a complainant was deathly afraid of being found out for who he or she was. There's a very personal side to being a complainant, and sometimes that gets lost in the mix, so it's important to remember. Also, you want to make sure that you preserve every aspect of your investigation system. Part of compliance programs means having an investigation program, and that program represents something towards your culture of compliance. Anonymity, confidentiality, and non-retaliation are all key parts of that. So it's time to arrange and set up your interviews. First, of course, you have to understand the who. Who are you going to have in person? It is recommended that you do interviews one person at a time. This is not a focus group. So you do not want 2, 3, 5 people in a room. Also, where? You want to make sure that you're conducting the interview in a non-threatening place and not in an overly confined space. You want to give personal space, to be honest. Also, make sure that you keep privacy in mind, and you want to have a place with minimal distractions. Choose an office or a conference room that's out of earsight. Make sure it's away from foot traffic. And when it comes to the when, effective timing is very important. You wouldn't want 2 interviewees to run into one another waiting outside of your interview room.
Yeah, the art of interviewing is really, you can get really deep into this area, and quite frankly, that we have programs where we spend a whole day talking about how to go about doing it. But basically, the same principles apply all interviews, and that is you really have to set a positive tone. You got to explain all the different things that would help reduce the stress on the person, because whether a person is guilty or not, they're nervous, and you've got to start off with a positive tone and begin to get them to relax. You can explain that again, that what they're going to be saying is confidential to only those that have a need to know. Never threaten anybody in an interview, whether they're a witness or the subject. And you're there to gather their facts. You're not there to offer your opinion. So don't in any way influence them. We'll talk a little bit more about leading questions, but don't offer any opinions on the matter. If they say, well, this is the reason why I think I was really was treated unfairly, and you can say, well, yeah, it sounds to me like they really did a bad job with you. Well, you don't need to do that. Also, is that there's another question. If there's an attorney in the room, you should always have your own attorney. Never go into a situation where somebody has a counsel present and you don't have counsel. There's some basic rules about that. I also wanted to talk a little bit beyond demeanor to the art of note-taking. If this is going to be like we talk about a conversation with a purpose and you want to have a dialogue, then it's important that you, to the degree possible, you maintain eye contact. Therefore, when you're taking your notes, just put cryptic notes down as minimum notes as possible, so you don't take your eye off for long periods of time on the person you're talking to. Immediately after the meeting, you can fill in the details, but try to maintain eye contact as much as possible. If you break eye contact for a long period of time, you really risk the full value of any interview we get involved in. And the art of questioning is to, you ask a question, you get an answer. You evaluate the response, you record the response, you may ask for some clarifications on it. But you know, you have different types of questions. You have the non-threatening questions that I mentioned that you have in establishing rapport. You have direct questions, and you have closing questions that you have to go through. And the types of questions are really the open-ended questions where you basically say to somebody, and a lot of times the best way to do it is have somebody say, look, in your own words, tell me what happened, and let them tell the story, and you jot down, and they will cover most of your questions. Even though you have the questions laid out in advance the way Kosh had mentioned, they may answer those questions without you asking it. And then at the end, you could get clarification or ask questions that they did not answer and they're open-ended. The closed-ended questions are narrowly focused. As I mentioned, they are usually on subject interviews, and they really require the yes or no answer, and you try to keep people on track by doing it. At the end, you might ask somebody, says, well, do you have any ideas about what this is? And they offer an opinion, but that's where you're going to leave that. The kind of questions you really need to avoid is leading questions. Is it a killer? If you lead a person to an answer, then you could prejudice the whole investigation. If you ask long and complicated questions, and they answer, you don't know what part of the question they're answering. So you can have a problem there. And you always avoid negatively phrased questions. So if you follow these tips on question organization, I think you'll save yourself a lot of problems.
I'd like you to raise your hand if you've ever seen the movie A Few Good Men. Now, since we're a webinar, I'm going to pretend that I saw someone raise their hand. When you do an investigation and you're conducting an interview, you are not trying to have a Tom Cruise moment. This is not the time to reenact your favorite episode of Law & Order or a cop show that you like either. I want to remind everyone on the line right now that we are not enforcement agencies. Interviewees are there voluntarily participating in an investigation. So when it comes to verification and summary, the catch-all questions, verifying to make sure that the way you're putting things down in your notes is what that interviewee said. It's not the time to have a hurrah moment that you saw on television. Keep that out of it, even if it may be tempting. But it is very important to summarize what the interviewee said and make sure that you can confirm that you've got it right. I also want to point out that the final bullet on this slide, using signed statements, this is rarely going to occur in most common investigations that we conduct as legal and compliance professionals in-house, but it can be used to pin down a person in formal investigations and become an important part of formal investigation reports.
This next slide, dealing with deception and lies, we have whole programs on this, and I used to think, well, boy, this is people, investigators are really interested in, until I finally realized that a lot of people love that program because you're talking about how you can recognize when somebody begins to engage in deception, and begin to find out that a lot of people were doing it because they thought they could use that technique on their fellow employees or their significant other. And so the fact is though, that I mentioned earlier about rapport, and we're asking really relaxed questions where it hasn't started up, and you're trying to lower the temperature down in the room because you want to observe people in that setting, and then later on you want to observe them later on when you ask ticklish questions. It's very important here. If you can recall how they were acting before and suddenly you see changes in behavior, you start asking more difficult questions. And there basically there's a whole bunch of clues on that, and I say we have a bunch of slides showing all kinds of different personalities when they were caught lying, that you can begin to see the signals that they give. But the fact is, the best thing to do is to recognize that if people start changing their behavior patterns during the course of the interview, and start asking more difficult questions, it usually means that you're getting on sensitive ground and there may be deception at work. When you're closing off an interview, what you really want to do is be sure you round up, make sure you have all the facts straight. You may want to summarize let me summarize the points that the person has told you about during the course of the interview. They may want to know what happens next. They may be, and you say, well, chances are this ends it, but if I have questions later on, can I call you and ask them? You certainly want to thank them for their time. You immediately after interview, review your notes and draft your reports promptly while the information and details are still fresh. Never have witnesses back up one right after the other where you cannot do that. And then, of course, recognize there are, we mentioned reports. Yeah, there's a report of the interview, and then there, of course, is the investigative report. So basically, when the interview is closed, you move to writing your notes up in detail immediately, and then you move on. The last step we're going to talk about, or step number 6, is of the final investigative report. I mentioned the structure report. I'll leave that up there for a few moments, but basically you can see the different things that would go into the report. This may be very elaborate for a small investigation, but basically it's just some ticking points that you might want to consider in the organization of your report. Effective investigative reports are really going to be clear, concise, and supported by full documentation. You're not writing the great American novel. Therefore, try to have short sentences, short paragraphs. Do never include any personal opinion in a report. This is an objective report of gathering of facts and evidence. The report format methodology should follow what, in fact, was agreed to at the outset of the investigation. And as Kosh mentioned earlier, never use slang or cop talk or things like that. It just really will turn off an independent third party who's reading the report. And just have to assume that the reports will be read not only by the deciding official, but potentially by outside parties, including government agencies or the court. And always treat the report as confidential or as a need-to-know document.
When you're writing your final report, every statement needs to be grounded with a fact. I also like to say that the final report should be written in crayon. Allow me to explain what I mean with that. One, can anyone pick up the report and understand what happened if they were not helping you conduct that investigation? Basically, can anyone understand what you wrote and the full story? And two, is it based on facts and facts alone? As Dick messaged, you really cannot embellish, and you can't lace a final report with your opinion. That's not your role, and that's not why you're there. In particular, you want to make sure that the facts speak for themselves, and they truly always will. A final report and an investigation report is not the time for creative writing. Which brings me to report writing tips. As you can tell, I'm incredibly verbose, but you never want to be wordy when it comes to an investigation report. You have a point, so make it. And as I said, make sure that this is not a time for you to insert creative writing. Keep your thoughts organized and clear so that your investigation report flows properly. When it comes to preparing for questions, your final report, and literally the conclusion of your investigation, is going to go to the deciding authority. And that individual or individuals are going to have questions. Once you write the report, basically your job is not over. As the deciding authority reviews your report, from the onset, they're going to ask what your opinion is. So be prepared to give your summary of what happened and also what is going to happen next. Investigations tend to uncover aspects of a compliance program or operations that you need to give attention to. And that really comes into what the recommendations of next actions will be. So be prepared to answer those questions. Some rules for the road. My cardinal rule, as Dick mentioned earlier, is do not disseminate or circulate a draft report in part or in its entirety, no matter who is asking. Submitting a raw and incomplete evidence report can sometimes prejudice a case or the deciding authority. Only distribute the final report to those who need to know as well.
The original report by the investigator, along with other written communications, will be delivered to the deciding official. Once again, as a reminder, do not have multiple drafts out there that can really come back to haunt you later on. And anyone who sees a report really should be on a need-to-know basis, and you know who you gave the report to. The fewer the reports, the better. All reports should be numbered and accounted for in accordance with your records management policy and procedures. And neither the complainant, quite frankly, nor the subject of the investigation needs to be given a copy of that report. And what goes into the final report is just sort of listed here as some ideas that you might want to consider. So take a look at those and just realize that there are a number of things that are needed in the case file itself besides just the report. Now we're going to step number 7, to close the case and the communication findings. There are a lot of different outcomes from these investigations, and this illustration is just to give you some idea. I'm not going to go through all of the points. They're sort of self-evident, but what you realize is that there are many things that can come as a result of an internal investigation other than taking adverse action against an individual. You can have changes in policy. You could have basically some management issues be just a number of different things that can come from an investigation once it is completed. The one outcome that can't occur is that you can't have a situation where you have a report go and is not acted upon. No decision is not the same as no action. No decision is where you fail to take action. It could really come back to haunt you, where an outside agency might say, well, why didn't you do something? Then you start explaining why it is you didn't do something. It's better to have a decision made, regardless of whether the decision is taking affirmative action or saying why an action is not necessary, but there must be an action. So at any rate, think about this, that you just can't just have something go, investigation get completed and just hang out there without something supporting it.
So adverse and corrective actions, this is really where the rubber meets the road. It's the what happens next. After all, what's the purpose of examining a potential problem and holding an investigation if you're not prepared to address it? At the end of the day, it comes down to fairness and consistency in how that you're going to address these problems as well. You want to make sure that any outcomes to your investigations are all documented and that there is consistency. You are setting a precedent for how future problems may be addressed inside your organization. And that leads me to this final slide about effective investigation programs. At the end of the day, you want to ask yourself, what do I have in place? Do I have adequate resources to conduct investigations appropriately? And what is the tone from the top? Do people in your organization trust the system? There have been times where investigations will unearth cultural problems. Sometimes they get highlighted in interviews and become secondary thoughts away from whatever initiated your investigation. At the end of the day, compliance programs are continually evolving and growing with an organization. There's always room for improvement. So you want to ask yourself, is your investigation program adequate and functioning in the way that you need it to? Which leads me to some concluding thoughts. An internal investigation is a tool that underscores an organization's commitment to complying with laws, regulations, and other written guidance. For example, your code of conduct, which I often call the constitution of your organization. An effective internal investigations program should be proactive and enable prompt intervention with emerging problems. And now I'm going to hand it over to one of our wonderful hosts who has some information for you.
Great. Thank you so much. This is Lynn Reinheimer with Wolters Kluwer, and I'm going to take just a quick 5 minutes to highlight our issues and action management solution. And then we're going to leave plenty of time for questions. There are a ton of questions in the queue. If you have any, now's a great time to submit them. But what we're doing with issue and action management is we're providing organizations with a tool to assist you in managing all of the things that you do and you deal with on a daily basis. A large aspect of that is going to be managing your response to issues and incidents that arise and being able to capture the things that you are doing as part of your investigation and tying together all of the documentation that's accumulating over the course of your investigation. So just as a very quick example on the screen, we have a potential scenario that could occur where physicians were receiving gifts in violation of company policies. And we have a potential issue here that we need to follow up on. So I can document what happened, but I'm also going to be able to document our response and capture the workflow of the steps that we're taking from when we learn of this issue all the way through to when a final determination or a resolution has occurred. So when Kash was talking, she mentioned investigations come down to building blocks. And if you see in the upper right corner of the screen, there's an icon with 3 building blocks. And if I click on this, what this is going to show me are all of the steps that are being taken over the course of the investigation, all of our building blocks. The investigation itself, the review of the policies, meeting with staff, whatever it might be, I'm going to be able to capture the steps that are being taken. So if I have to be able to demonstrate our due diligence in responding to this issue, that I'm going to be able to do it. And as those steps are being taken and documentation is accumulating, it can be attached. and tied to what you're capturing in the system. That could be a report of findings. It could be interview notes or statements. It could be your final report. It could be a copy of the policy that was perhaps in violation. But with a simple drag and drop, being able to tie all of the supporting documentation that is generating outside of this application, tying it to what you're building into the application. And having this central location where all of the individuals in the departments and the groups that are going to be involved in this can come to capture what they're doing and to be able to see what the other members of the team are working on. So we saw in the slides, investigation can involve compliance, it can involve legal, it can involve human resources, it can span different departments. So you have one central location where they can come to work and to manage the process within the system. And to be able to quickly and easily generate reports on what you're doing, being able to see open versus closed investigations, being able to see how long it's taking you to close out your investigations and close out these issues in the system, managing your timeliness, having reports that you're going to be able to present to a board or to other stakeholders. This is just a screenshot of an example of what a board report could perhaps look like in our system, utilizing the IBM Cognos reporting that we provide in issue and action management. And one last point being, this isn't simply a tool for issues and incident management and response. It can be used for anything that you do and you deal with on a daily basis. So that could be periodic education with staff, auditing or monitoring activities, capturing meetings, capturing questions that you receive. And it can be used enterprise-wide because you get unlimited users and usage. So it can be used in compliance, risk management, human resources, IT, legal, and give you a consistency across the organization in how this information is being captured and how you're reporting on it and how you're managing it. So that is our issue and action management solution. So at this point, I am going to turn this over to Beth to start to take us through any of the questions that came in.
Thank you very much, and thank you to our great speakers. We have lots of questions today, folks, so I'm going to caveat this with that we'll never get to all of them, and that we do commit to either somebody from strategic management or someone from the Wolters Kluwer team will get back to you as soon as possible with answers, because there are so many great ones. Here's the first. Can you address the use of specialists such as forensic IT auditors, consultants, outside counsel? Could you do that, please? Either, I guess, Dick or Kosh.
Well, I mean, I think that's a great question. There are a lot of times where, as I mentioned earlier, you want to use outside consultants, whether it be legal or consultants like myself and Dick. I think it really comes down to what is the issue at hand and what resources do you have in-house or specialized knowledge where it might be better to have an outside counsel, an outside auditor, or a consultant come in and take a look. It really does come down to specialized knowledge.
Let me add to that. I was hesitant to respond because, quite frankly, oh yeah, we'd be happy to do an investigation for you, but I think that's a wrong tack to take. I think you're much better if you can invest in your own in-house capabilities, because you know the turf, you know the people, you know the operations. If at all possible, investigation should be done internally. Getting outside experts in, if it's really a difficult problem, or if it involves the CEO or member of the board or something like that, it certainly makes sense to do that. Also keep in mind is, and I don't want to have this come out wrong, but quite frankly, there are doctors and there are doctors. So you don't go to a dermatologist if you need to have some neurosurgery. The same thing is true with attorneys. You have attorneys and you have attorneys. It doesn't mean that every attorney is an expert in conducting investigations and knows how to have properly debrief somebody. The fact of the matter is attorneys oftentimes really have difficulty getting people off of high stress mode because of the fact they're nervous about them. Also, that attorneys, if they represent the organization, feel the need to give the upjohn warning, which basically is sort of like a Miranda warning that they could be used against them. That tends to shut down information and rapport very, very quickly. So if at all possible, I would recommend you try to develop an in-house capability and rely upon outsiders only for those areas, as Kosh mentioned, that where you really need that outside expertise. Whether it's somebody dealing with really a difficult legal issue area that an attorney is really qualified to handle, or with some sort of regulatory issue, or some sort of special problem because it involves a high-level person in the organization, and that you really don't want to have that done internally. So, but try to do it internally as much as possible, is my advice, rather than hiring people on the outside. It's much more expensive to do that, and it's not as efficient.
So here's a question, thank you, to follow that one up. Perfect timing. Is it better to conduct an interview as a team rather than by yourself?
It's great if you're the FBI or you're the Inspector General. They can afford to have a team do it. The reality is that in dealing with literally more than a couple thousand organizations since we've had the firm here, I will tell you that it is a rare luxury that you could have 2 qualified people to conduct interviews. Normally it's a one-on-one. Also, it changes the dynamics. If it's a conversation with purpose, with one person talking to another, that's one thing. However, one of the things that we do in our training program is that if in fact you have a need, or you make sense for you to have 2 people conducting an interview, then you have to be very careful how you conduct the interview. We talk about the seating as you do it, who asks the questions, who takes the notes, how you position yourself so that you can not lose fully the conversation that you want to have with the individual. So there's techniques to be employed, but you'll have to apply new techniques and specialized techniques if and used 2-on-1, because otherwise it looks like you might be kind of beating up on somebody, and that is another problem that you have in terms of intimidation and getting people away from feeling very stressed about a situation. So I personally would say that 90-some-odd% of the investigations that are going to be conducted really should be done by an individual. It doesn't mean that you can't have a team doing the investigation. It means that when you're doing individual interviews, it's better to have one-on-one. When you get to a subject interview, however, that's different. At the end of the investigation, if it turns out that you have an individual that is looked like that they were basically engaged in wrongdoing and some sort of adverse action may result from that, then for that interview, definitely you don't want to be alone. You want to have a witness.
And to add on to that, the idea of rapport and having a conversation with a purpose, if you have more than one person conducting the interview, you risk making it feel like it's a firing squad, and that individual that you're interviewing may not want to tell their story and really answer those open-ended questions that are like casting a net for interviewers like myself. Further, if you are going to conduct an interview and you have a second person in the room with you, perhaps who's taking notes, I do want to warn people about if that second person is taking notes on a laptop. Sometimes if a second interviewer is more quiet than active and taking notes on a laptop, the interviewee might have the impression that they're taking a transcript, and that can make an individual incredibly nervous. So it is important to try not to use a laptop if you're going to be in that situation. So we do live in a technological age where I know I have my laptop almost all the time, but be considerate of the fact that they may think you're taking a transcript, and you might want to make sure they know that you're not. That makes people way more at ease to speak openly.
And again, what you want to do is maintain eye contact as much as possible. By the way, we left this one slide up here with our emails. Kosh mentioned, and I did too several times, about a policy document, which is a good protocol document when dealing with legal counsel. If any of you want to get that, be sure to ask for it. But also, that number is up there. If any of you want to subscribe to the Walter Kluwer's blog that I do on compliance tips and updates, if you want me to register you for you, I can do that. Just send me an email and I can have you added, or you can do it yourself.
And just to add on to that, if anyone listening right now and attending has questions for Dick and I, please feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to field your questions after this webinar is over as well.
Because there's lots of them I'm not getting to. We use the term fact-finding when we begin our dialogue with individuals. Is that an acceptable and a good coverall? And they put that in quotes.
When you say coverall, did the individual elaborate on that?
No.
Almost like an open question? Well,
Yeah.
Let me see if I maybe have an idea of what this individual is asking. There are a lot of open-ended questions that you can ask to gather the facts, because at the end of the day, being part of an interview, you know that your interviewer is looking for facts, looking for that story. So that is a coverall in certain ways, because You are looking for the story and for the facts. So it's not uncommon to start off an interview by saying, tell me what happened, and setting the context for your questions. Hopefully that addresses their concern.
It depends on the dynamic, again, between a subject interview, the conclusion of the investigation, and a witness interview. Kosh had mentioned the real value of preparing for each interview by knowing what you want to ask. She also warned, do not use it as a script by which you go down a list of questions and seek answers, because you're going to change the dynamic and make it more of an inquisition than a dialogue. But you want those questions there because you don't want to miss anything. But the idea of having an open-ended question, where you say, as Kosh said, tell me what happened, and what do you remember happening, or whatever, and open it up and let them talk about it, and then encouraging them. By and large, they will answer most of the questions you have on your list, and then at the end, those questions which remain unanswered or unclear, then you can use your little cheat list to make sure you could close the loop on those things which were still dangling. But open-ended questions are much, much better to let people tell things in their own words. I cannot tell you, and this I'll take this going back to my days in the FBI, I cannot tell you how many times somebody, one of my colleagues would really screw up an investigation interview by trying to go down a script and not allow the person to tell their own story, because in many cases what you have is they'll open up whole new arenas that you didn't even know existed that related to the incident, and would move the whole investigation in a different direction that never would have come out if it was simply a question of asking a question, getting an answer, asking another question, getting an answer. But allowing them to open it up, you begin to see that maybe you need additional questions, and maybe the investigation has to be a little broader in scope than you originally thought.
And to add on to that, at the end of an interview, I've always found that it's very helpful to ask, is there anything else that you'd like to add, or that I haven't mentioned yet? And give them that catch-all for the fact-finding question to make sure that if there's anything else on that person's mind that they feel you should know, they tell you.
We have 3 minutes left, so I'm going to try to get one more in, and I apologize again to everyone else. Have you any template flowcharts that could help sort out what department or departments who are involved in risk management are most likely responsible based on topic? Interesting. What do you think?
Well, there was a slide early on in the presentation where Dick had gone over different policies and different sources of complaints dealing with issues. Typically in operations, you're going to know what department a certain situation is going to fall under. I've also seen a number of organizations where on their policies and procedure documents, they will reference a particular department that owns that policy. That's an automatic cheat sheet to put towards your flow chart.
Yeah, I think if you want to avoid turf battles, there's nothing worse than we go into a situation where an investigation got screwed up because you had contesting parties to an issue, and it was not done collaboratively as Kosh had, advised, or was not done in cooperation. That's why we keep going back to get all the policies and procedures in place you can that will govern all this process, so that these issues are ironed out before you have a live issue in front of you. Once you have a live issue in front of you, if you have not resolved the potential turf issues, then it could become very contentious.
And as a person who loves flowcharts, I will say to give yourself room to collaborate. It may not always be cut and dry, and even though an investigation may fall strictly under compliance, as I said earlier on in the presentation, sometimes there's a lot of great value in looping in a different department, whether it's privacy, HR, or legal. So you have that collaborative effort. So it may not always fall squarely into that flowchart that you want to build.
Thank you. Before we sign off and thank everyone, I just want to answer a couple of easy ones for everyone. Yes, the slides are still up there. Please make sure to get them. Also, this will be on our website within a day, so you will be getting an email from our marketing team and Mary Starks talking about the survey, getting you your CEOs, and you can link to see the webinar again, assuming that you want to share this with other teammates. So I'd like to thank Dick and Kosh for an absolutely wonderful webinar, and Lynn for her mini demo. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to them or to us directly. And thank you, everyone.